Before you invest all your time in your VR game, make sure you prototype it first. That's the focus of today's episode, so let's get to it. You are listening to the How to Create VR podcast, weekly conversations with VR professional creators, designers, and producers. Hello and welcome to another episode of the How to Create VR podcast, where I speak with professional creators, designers, developers, and producers who work on VR, AR, and MR projects. I'm Marcelo, VR developer and evangelist at howtocreatevr.com. I produce this weekly podcast and a monthly hands-up VR meetup in Southern California. To learn more, just visit howtocreatevr.com. My guest today is Katie Hughes. She leads the product design of Beast Pets, a startup that makes smart and magical pets for XR. She is also the co-founder of the meetup Room Scale Designers. Katie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
I met you at VRLA. I was checking out your Beast Pets VR experience, which is very cool, and we're going to talk about it in a little bit. But before we do that, why don't you give us a bit about your background?
Yeah, no problem. So as you mentioned before, right now I lead product design for Beast Pets, and I also helped co-found and lead Room Scale Designers, which is a meetup group focused on teaching VR design and UX in the Bay Area. In a previous life, I worked in ad tech in product marketing and account management. Before that, I studied advertising and graphic design at NYU, but I have a background in studio art, so I have a real creative side.
So how did you get into VR? How did you make that jump from marketing to VR?
Yeah, so I think I began hearing murmurs about VR in the office back when I worked in ad tech. And having read Ready Player One a million years ago, I was like, oh, wait, VR, it's here, it's now. And I was basically like, I want in on this. So that day, I basically got out my credit card, Googled virtual reality classes, and signed up for a weekend workshop in VR creation that was actually taking place that weekend. I'm pretty fortunate to be living in the Bay Area in a location where signing up for that was possible. And my first VR experience was actually at that workshop, watching something on the Samsung Gear VR. I don't remember the name, but I just couldn't believe that the immersive technology that I dreamed about as a kid was finally here.
So prior to that, you had no VR experience in the sense of actually trying out a VR game or anything like that. You went from just hearing about it to pulling out your credit card, signing up, and start creating it.
Yep, no experience whatsoever.
Wow, that's pretty cool. So you jumped into VR, and what was your first full-blown experience after attending that class that just blew your mind?
After that class, I think one of the first things I tried was the HTC Vive and Tilt Brush.
Oh yeah, that's a good one to blow your mind.
Right? It's actually still my favorite VR experience today. I know it's not the most unique answer, but being able to physically recreate the images in my mind and draw it all around me basically fulfills a childhood dream of mine. And I prefer things like that are more experiential and help me to express my thoughts and ideas into the real world.
Oh, I totally remember when I first tried Tilt Brush and I was just drawing just flat, thinking that that's what you do. And then I moved and I'm like, what? I can see from the other side. And then I'm like, wait a minute, can I draw around me? And I'm like, oh my God. So, oh no, totally. I could see why that's one of your favorites. It's definitely one of my favorites as well. So you're now a designer, I guess, for VR, the lead designer for VR at Beast Pets. So tell us about Beast Pets. What is that about?
A little bit about Beast Pets. We're creating magical pets for XR. Our current product is in virtual reality arcades across the world, where you get to explore the Beast Pets universe and meet the baby dragons. Eventually, we'll be expanding the Beast universe and bringing it to mobile AR as well. So that way you can bring the Beast Pets into your world. And our long-term vision is to create magical universe, but not only that, you get to have this magical pet that can learn and grow with you. over time.
So are you guys ever thinking of tying it to a physical environment later on where I can take my pet from that's in virtual land and bring it into my real world via some productization or anything like that?
Yep, that's the plan. We have a couple different things we're exploring involving mixed reality, augmented reality, and different physical products.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So obviously when you guys started this, you didn't just jump in and just started developing and designing this and then just put it out there. You guys probably came up with a prototype, and obviously that's the whole point of this podcast today, is to talk about prototyping for VR. So why don't we start by answering the question, why is it important to you to prototype?
It's just so important and yet so underutilized, I think. I think prototyping is highly underutilized in the VR community right now. I believe there are so many things that can be tested and refined in VR experiences before really dedicating the time and resources to making a finalized build. I think ultimately there's many ways you can test different concepts in advance, which ultimately saves time and money and makes for a better product. I care about this a lot because I've demoed so many like full-blown shipped VR experiences that like within minutes made me feel physically ill, or where I couldn't figure out the UI, or where I couldn't progress in a game because the game object I needed to interact with was out of reach or not in my line of sight because it wasn't tested on people under 5'5", or things like that. So I think often we tend to forget when developing that we are not our users. And I believe prototyping and testing can help mitigate serious UX issues before going live.
Why don't you explain the difference between the full-blown VR and a prototype? Well, what is the difference there?
I think a prototype is something that can be a lower fidelity or just an aspect of the product, where I think something that's more like full-blown is something that's already shipped or released or being demoed at a conference, something that's more widely available to the public. But a prototype can be just, maybe one scene or one part of the product where you can test bits and pieces on people. And that's, something a little bit lower fidelity, I would say, less features, but accurately portrays the concept or objective, and you can test how users react to it.
So if you want to add, let's say, a new feature to something that's out there already, maybe you can prototype that first in a small version of it and put it out and see what people think. And then if it works, or make adjustments and then bring it into the real experience.
Yeah, I think that's the great way to do it. You're able to test that segment and make iterations on it based on user feedback and any pain points you see. And that ultimately enhances the final product.
Right. Well, and speaking of final products, obviously in final products, you use a lot of 3D assets, right? Which that's very time consuming. In a prototype, do you create like low fidelity 3D assets, or do you just like use off the shelf, like generic ones that you're going to replace later? What's your process with the assets themselves?
Yeah, so for any new 3D asset or game object that we plan on introducing into the Beast Pets experience, we do research and we make 2D prototypes and mood boards first to convey our ideas about what this asset might look like and all the possible beast and player interactions around that asset. So we do that and have discussion on it as a team before spending time making the final asset. And we also have created low to medium fidelity, like 3D assets and scenes to test out user reactions before investing the time and resources into creating the high fidelity final version.
I see. So let's talk a little bit about UI and UX metaphors. Do you prepare a variety of different ways? I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. Like if you have a door and you have a handle on the door, do you put different kinds of handles to test out how the users will react to that door and how to open it? Because, that line between interface and content shouldn't be there, right? The interface should be the content. So during your prototype, do you come up with various different metaphors of UX and test them out and then decide on which one works best? Or what's your process in that?
Usually we'd explore several different options and have a team brainstorming session before settling on what we want to test out. So we will usually test out a couple different options to see what works best in the environment and what stage we're at in the process. Because you're right, there is a lot of time the UI and there is a lot of overlap between content and UI. So trying to decide how we want to best incorporate the UI into the Beast world and keep it an immersive experience, that is really important. So it's usually a bit of trying to find the balance between where we are in our project and what's going to make the most sense and what we can continue iterating on later. We do have elements of the UI that are interactive and more like 3D physical objects in the universe that you can manipulate, but we also have some 2D UI elements where we try to present it in a more magical way to stay consistent with the brand and the environment.
You just mentioned interactive elements. So do you use a prototype to figure out what users want to be interactive? Let me give you an example. Let's say you have a table and there's objects there and some of them you can't touch. I mean, they're there, but you can't grab. And all of a sudden you start seeing users going for them. Do you use that prototype to figure out, oh, maybe we should make these interactive?
Yeah, actually, we have used even lower fidelity, less digital methods of testing that out. What comes to mind when you say that is one time we were exploring a way to present part of the narrative in the UI, and I actually made a paper prototype in the shape of a pop-up book and cut out, drew little representations of the dragons and the universe, as well as different game objects that we envisioned having in the scene to convey the message and next steps. And I was able to test that out on users before we even built anything in VR and got some surprising learnings about what users wanted to interact with versus what I expected them to want to interact with or what I thought they would want to interact with. So before even moving into anything digital, I was able just to test that and with kind of like a 3D paper prototype.
So you do a lot of this offline prototyping without technology? So like paper, do you use clay? Do you use other kinds of materials to put things together?
Yeah, I think there's a perception that to prototype in VR, you need to do things like wildly differently than you would for like standard 2D projects. But I found that there's so much you can do just using your typical UX tools. Like I use a lot of pen and paper. I use Sketch, Principle, Adobe products. Even use like modeling clay to create 3D things before, to try to explore prototyping with modeling clay. And you can also, because it's VR and you are creating environments and interactions in a 3D space, you can actually use real life objects in your environment and just place them around you to test things like distance and how game objects would relate to the user and where they would be in the environment. So those are all things you can do before you even jump into VR, basically.
And those are obviously much quicker and cheaper to do than jumping into Unity and spending 3 weeks on it.
Yeah, and it's a lot more accessible as well.
So once you have all these prototypes that are offline ready, and even online prototypes, how do you target the actual users that you're going after for testing the prototype?
Yeah, so one of my key roles at Beast Pets when I first started as a contractor was defining our key user personas. So whenever we have a prototype, we try to reach out to these target audiences, at least to get some sort of feedback on what they think of key concepts or what they see in different UI elements that I present. We have done a lot of on-site testing at various locations with volunteers to give us feedback, walking through experiences and giving them goals and seeing what happens and identifying pain points. Usually after about 10 usability tests, you're able to see some patterns on probably user pain points and where we can probably iterate and enhance the product. Other things we do is conduct user surveys to get data on key habits, on what users see when they look at different images, to identify user needs. And we also keep in touch pretty closely with the VR arcades that we work with to understand their needs and their customers' needs and iterate from there.
Now, you mentioned arcades, so let's talk about prototyping for VR arcades, which I would imagine is much different than prototyping for VR experiences that are targeting the home, right? You have a bigger space. In your case, I think you have multiple people can be in that environment at the same time, correct?
Yes, right. Multiplayer is on our roadmap, but right now it's single player.
Is it different prototyping for VR that is headed towards the arcades or LBE versus VR that is for the home?
I think it's less that the prototyping itself is different and more like the product or content itself is tailored differently from the get-go to accommodate an arcade type of setup versus a home setup. There is a lot of overlap though, but we do have to keep things in mind because things like, that the player can't necessarily save their progress at an arcade. So how do we design content that is on brand and also replayable? That's important for an arcade experience versus perhaps a home experience where players are able to save their progress and things of that nature. So making sure that we create a seamless. So the other thing that's important for designing for VR arcades is making sure that we create a seamless user experience for those that are brand new to VR. We've learned that a lot of people who go to VR arcades are brand new to it. They have never tried it before, and this is kind of their first interaction with high-end VR. So a lot of our development and design reflects these users, which may be different from home users, which might be more of the early adopters and know how to use the technology. We have to assume that for our current arcade audience that maybe they've never tried it before. How are we going to create a seamless onboarding experience? What are the ages and heights of the people who might be playing? We've learned things like through testing that a child's hand might not be able to use the grip features on the Vive controllers or reach the menu button per se. So how do we design the interactions and use inputs that are user friendly specifically for this audience?
It seems that there's a lot more variables to consider when designing for LBE/arcade, at least from the prototype perspective, than for the home, just because of everything you just mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So how long do you spend on prototyping? Let's say of your entire project. Do you have an idea of what percentage of time you take?
So that's a tough one to gauge. We're a lean, mean team of 3 people. So we have such rapid sprints. So it really depends for bigger projects. Like recently we had a big UI overhaul where I spent probably 4 to 6 weeks straight, strictly researching and usability testing and iterating on the UI design. And then we had major update to these pets following that. But for smaller things, we find lean ways to prototype and test while simultaneously developing. We've probably tested over 1,500 users in person. So sometimes we draw off our knowledge base of user habits and can try to anticipate user needs and then follow up with our beta testers once we have shipped the update. and then iterate as needed. We've really leaned into the UX mentality as a team. But since we are a team of 3 and have such a growing audience base and kind of like 1,000 things to do at once all the time, we have ways to work together to source feedback and test product ideas on the go.
So how do you decide how much functionality to add to a prototype? Like, is there a rule, or is this just basically, it depends on the project?
Yeah, I'd say it depends on the project and our timeline and objective, as well as the stakeholder. So if the goal is to create a new environment in the Beast universe, sometimes a mock-up and tilt brush is all that is really needed to convey the look or feel or display the proposed interactive objects to the stakeholders within the company. It also depends on what stage you're at in the design process, I think. So like when I was initially redesigning the UI, I didn't need to conduct usability tests for users in VR to get their input on how they interpreted the illustrations. That was something I could do just on my laptop screen or by emailing GIFs, little animations to see what users thought was happening or see what their response was to the new UI design. But I'd say, however, like once we got to a higher level of fidelity, I would actually need to look at that same imagery or the iterations of that imagery in a VR setting to gauge things like image size, font size, readability, accessibility, how the colors showed up, how far the UI should be from the user, and things like that. So after those iterations, we would conduct usability testing with users in VR and proceed accordingly.
So when do you say, okay, we're done? What's the trigger that goes, okay, we're done with prototype, we've tested, now let's start implementing? Is there a specific set of triggers that you follow normally, or is it, we give up, let's just do this now?
I'd say normally after a fair amount of testing, we're able to identify the pain points, and we usually divide things into levels like what is a stopgap solution to fix this problem, what would be, the short term and then the long term solution. So depending on the project and the time frame and the level of importance of the feature at hand, we try to at least find a solution that works in the short term and helps lead eventually to a longer term, more comprehensive solution if we don't have the time to do that at the moment. So it's usually, I'd say, there's never really too much of a I give up point. It's more of, okay, we've figured out that this is a user pain point. Here are some potential solutions that users respond well to. What can we build in the short term that will help us achieve the longer term goal?
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, you mentioned a lot of tools you use for prototyping, both offline and technology tools. Do you use VR itself? Do you create it in Unity if you do, or do you use Tilt Brush or some other apps that are within VR itself?
Yeah, I've found Tilt Brush and Google Blocks to be particularly helpful. And I also do use Unity, and you don't necessarily need to be able to code actually to manipulate objects in Unity, which is something I see a lot of UX designers who are interested in VR get a little nervous about. But Unity, I think, is another tool that's super helpful for prototyping. And there's also some promising VR prototyping apps on the horizon geared towards UX designers, developers per se, and that would be like Moment XR and Sketchbox. I'm excited to see where those go.
Interesting. Are those in Steam already? Do you know?
I think Moment XR is an alpha and Sketchbox is on Steam right now.
So, Katie, we're pretty much getting to the end here, but there is one more question that I like to ask all my guests, and that's describe what you would like VR to be in 2025 or thereabouts.
So my initial thought was about how immersive it could be and how interactive it could be and all the new hardware updates that could make it more seamless of an experience overall. But what I think I really want VR to be like in 2025 is have it be created by and friendly to people of all genders and races and orientations. I really hope and want it to be built by and accessible to all sorts of different people. And I want the experiences to reflect diverse standpoints and diverse groups of people. And I really hope that underrepresented groups in tech currently get a chance to influence this emerging technology from the ground up. So that's something that's important to me. And I think now is the time to start working towards that 2025 goal.
Well, that's a great closing thought. So, Katie, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. I really appreciate all the information you shared with us.
Of course. Thank you.
If people want to get a hold of you or learn more about Beast Pets, give URLs, Twitter, whatever you like.
Yeah. Find us at Beast Pets on Instagram and Twitter. Send us an email if you're interested in being a home beta tester at hello@beastpets.com. You can also find Beast Pets at VR arcade locations near you at locations.beastpets.com. And find me personally on Twitter at Hughesilla, HUGHEZILLA.
We'll put all that information in the show notes. So, Katie, thank you so much. And to the rest of you, I'm glad you were here with me. If you enjoyed this podcast, please remember to subscribe, leave a comment, and like us on iTunes or SoundCloud. For more episodes, check out howtocreatevr.com/iTunes or howtocreatevr.com/SoundCloud. If you are ever in the Southern California area, we have a monthly meetup with lots of great presentations. You can join or RSVP for our next meetup at howtocreatevr.com/meetup. Finally, if you are interested in learning more about how to create VR, AR, and MR experiences, please visit howtocreatevr.com. So until the next episode, I'm your host, Marcelo Lewin. Cheers, everyone.